now. So Claire is a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford, looking at 20th century philosophical and popular understandings of the authentic, and how this might be applied to the use of classical tropes in literature of the period. In particular, how we might navigate the ideas of perceived authentic connections with antiquity. So after a BA in classics and English at Oxford and MPhil in classical reception at Bristol, Claire worked in education and communication before returning to academia in 2020. She's one of the two archivists of the archival performances of Greek and Roman drama at the APGRD, which many of you would be familiar with, and co-hosts Live Classics, the APGRD podcast. And a paper today is titled, "Now that the wind has deprived the statues of their fig leaves, I can hardly bear to look out, Queer Appropriations of Edwardian Classicism." And I'm gonna leave it over to her now.
Hello, thank you very much for that introduction, Eleonora, and thank you to all three of you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm just going to share my screen, which hopefully everyone can now see. Just give me a shout if that's visible.
We cannot see the screen, I think. Sorry.
Oh, hang on. Classic Zoom. Aha.
Great, fantastic. Now we can. Thank you.
Awesome. Brilliant. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking through selected examples from E.M. Forster and Ronald Firbank. I'll specifically be looking at how both these authors appropriate and interpret the scholarly classicism of their upbringings, but specifically how we can subvert expectation around this engagement. Both were born in the late 19th century, Forster in 1879, Firbank in 1886, writing through the Edwardian period, just tipping into early modernism. So it's a general kind of assumption that both represent a key period, both in terms of literary thought, but also socio-political attitudes towards the teaching of Latin and Greek in Britain. What I'm specifically interested in talking about today, however, is how this very particular subsection of queer identity starts in this period to begin to diverge from the Uranian Phil-Hellenist hinterground of the 19th century, and how we might use this understanding to inform our own contemporary discourse when taking queer approaches to classical material. Just a quick content note, there will at some point in this presentation be a brief discussion of pederasty, just to give you a heads up on that. So, in yesterday's keynote, Mathura spoke about the queer public school boys that we all carry around in our back pockets, and often perhaps regrettably find that we have recourse to when trying to ground and substantiate our arguments. I'm acutely aware, especially in the context of all the radical work being undertaken by many people attending this conference, that my addition of, to quote Eleonora, more rich white gaze into that already overstuffed pocket or carrier bag or whatever receptacle you personally might be working with might initially seem a little bit perverse. I do believe, however, that the material I'm about to take you through today does continue to warrant consideration and scrutiny, although this is often made harder for me by the fact that Forster and Firbank don't operate as I would wish them to. Both are queer figures, but both are also products of an exclusionary intersection of race, class, and gender, and their work, whilst in many ways transformative, does still play into all of these. So to laud the likes of Forster and Firbank as wholly positive, ancestral queer figures worthy of wholesale celebration is obviously to overlook multiple other voices at work. Equally, however, I'm not seeking to dismiss them as irrelevant to our contemporary understanding. Kaji Amin puts this much better than I can when approaching the problematic legacy of Genet in his book Disturbing Attachments. The failure of my object of study to behave in the ways that I hoped he would, his failure to consistently and routinely secrete political value was not his alone. It was a failure endemic to the project of revalorizing deviance. So I would seek then to approach the context surrounding both my writers in the plural. They're not emblematic of a single queer voice in this period, and nor is the manner in which Forster in particular has been received, including in queer circles, necessarily as straightforward as we might initially like to think. For instance, whilst they were born only 7 years apart, Forster and Firbank are frequently overlooked as contemporaries. In part, I think this is because Forster's influence does loom much further into the 20th century than that of Firbank, who died young in 1926, but also because of what I understand to be differing attitudes and presentations of queer identity in their writing. So whilst in many ways Firbank is the one who was, as it were, left behind in the early part of the century, he was the one who lived openly as a queer man, and his works, who have been championed highly by Alan Hollinghurst, W.H. Auden, and actually Forster himself, are often understood to reflect this attitude. Forster, on the other hand, has been popularly characterised as quite a closeted figure. He's sometimes depicted as an early Edwardian relic who's at odds with the increasingly emancipated world that he grew to inhabit. Even now, he remains best known not for his engagement with queerness, but for his navigation of class consciousness and interpersonal sensibility. I'm thinking novels like A Room with a View, Howard's End, etc., often turned into sweeping Merchant Ivory productions later in the century. And when his direct engagement with queer identity is discussed, it's usually his posthumously published novel Morris, which looms large. That also was given the Merchant Ivory treatment, very memorably with Hugh Grant. And while aspects of Morris, particularly with regard to understandings of so-called Platonic love in this period, will remain present throughout my argument, I also want to start incorporating passages from two collections of Forster's short stories, The Celestial Omnibus, published in 1911, and The Life to Come, which draws out very similar themes, but far more explicitly, and consequently was posthumously published in 1972, along with Morris. So, the fact that products of this late Victorian, early Edwardian public school system, a period when compulsory Greek Oxbridge was still in favour and making frequent allusions to antiquity in their work, is obviously not in and of itself surprising. Firbank attended Uppingham School, Forster Tunbridge, and both went on to Cambridge. Nor is it surprising that these upper-class queer men utilise classical tropes to intimate homosexual desire. For instance, one of Maurice's early interactions while at Cambridge, which is on your screen currently, is being asked if he has read Plato's Symposium as a tacit way of reading his sexual preference. I would argue, however, that what's happening here is not merely a reflection of pervasive themes, but a direct confrontation of them. The earlier short stories in particular, and Morris, which was written around 1913 in spite of its later publication, represent comparatively early responses to a post-Wilde world and are, I would argue, representative of a reassessment and refutation of the queer classicism seeded during the late 19th century. The themes evident in both writers represent a key turn then in attitudes towards classics during this period, with Forster and Firbank firmly contributing their own links to the chain of reception. To quote Forster himself, a mirror, or in this case a body of text, does not develop because a historical pageant passes in front of it. It only develops when it gets a fresh coat of quicksilver. In other words, when it acquires new sensitiveness. And whilst the mirror inherited after the long 19th century may have been one gilded by the likes of Ellis, Symonds, Pater, Jowett, and Wilde, these modes of scholarship are not necessarily reflected as we move into the Edwardian summer and beyond. If the 19th century sought to define and pathologise male homosexual desire, imposing more concrete gender binaries and, to quote Dan Orrells, the canalisation of sexuality between the banks of homo and heterosexuality, this later period begins to interrogate, however tentatively, a greater degree of nuance. Could we perhaps identify elements of a prototype for conversations which are only now beginning to gain significant traction, both in terms of the plurality of queer experience and also the disproportionate weighting which classical antiquity has traditionally enjoyed? The reified, colonialised classical experience, which both Forster and Firbank would have been born into, is excellently outlined in Christopher Stray's Classics in Britain, Scholarship, Education and Publishing. In particular, his observation that, quote, in learning grammar by rote in the lower forms of public schools, boys, as they almost all were learning both to learn and to obey, the two faces of disciplina, end quote. Classics in 19th and early 20th century Britain was not simply a playground for queer thought, even among the elite who sought to identify themselves with it. Classical subjects still comprise the mainstay of establishment attitudes, including those which define masculinity and the type of man which British educational institutions thought they ought to be producing. Latin and Greek, of course, loomed large on the curriculum, and any dilution of this was often interpreted as a risk to the fabric of masculine scholarly identity itself. Christopher Wordsworth, head of Harrow School, was not alone in his impassioned criticism of the use of English seeping into the study of classics. Tellingly, his specific worry is that this will invite, quote, mental effeminacy. And it's this spectral schoolmaster figure, which on a surface level at least, both Forster and Firbank seem to be unseating. His tenure is over and he can no longer dictate the terms of classical engagement. The passage now on your screen is taken from Forster's The Celestial Omnibus, a short story in which a small boy discovers a magic omnibus service which takes him to a true Arcadia. There he meets writers and figures from classical art and literature, and the unnamed boy tells his adult neighbour, the self-important president of the Literary Society, Mr. Bonds. And Mr. Bonds demands that he accompany the boy. He's furious that such an amazing opportunity has been wasted on what he terms an ignorant child. For instance, the boy is given a lift in the omnibus by Dante, and he mistakes him for a bus driver called Dan. Yet when the boy and Mr. Bonds arrive in Arcadia, it's the honest, earnest boy who is raised aloft on Achilles' shields to sit alongside heroes, literally becoming part of that ekphrastic moment and crowned with laurels. Whereas an apoplectic Mr. Bonds is unable to see the beauty before him, all he can see is fog. He eventually stumbles into the fog, is hurled earthwards, and his body winds up behind Bermondsey Gasworks. In Forster's Falmouth, Firbank's Falmouth, these assumptions around classicized masculinity and respectability are also refuted in a much more obviously queer-coded way, however. The quote I've selected is from a conversation between two women, inhabitants of the fictional seaside resort Falmouth, who confess a preference for what they term effeminate men and cite Spartans decorating themselves for battle as a justification for this. In his article, Robust Body and Social Souls, David Deutsch covers in further detail how Firbank invites his reader to reassess their assumptions about the queer male body. In his 1922 novel, The Flower Beneath the Foot, Firbank further ironises the image of the frustrated classical scholar poring over his Greek, while all around him others are engaging and embracing the erotic potential of the Hellenic without inhibition. Count Cabinet, the exile's dignitary, is sitting uncomfortably at the side of a lake, pretending to concentrate on his Greek verse, while his handsome amanuensis, Peter Passer, or Passer, I think we can maybe read a Catullus allusion there, is swimming naked. In an added layer of irony, while this scene is unfolding, the reader knows that two female characters, Mademoiselle Blumengast and Countess Ivora, are stuck on a becalmed boat halfway across the lake and making the most of this opportunity to experiment with lesbian sex. Their interaction is redolent with elegiac imagery, right down to the loosened hair and crisp Greek key patterned tunic worn by the Countess. So two adjacent points are immediately thrown up for me by this passage. Firstly, while Firbank sends up the schoolmaster figure here in the guise of Count Cabinet, he's doing so by presenting him in a typically pederastic mode. Firbank is quite a difficult figure in this regard, and many of his stories, influenced no doubt by Wilde and Baron Corvo, play on typical pederastic tropes, drawing both from ancient Greece and the Catholic Church. It's interesting to note, however, that here Count Cabinet's desire is the frustrated one, and it's almost derided, whereas the two adult women in the boat are enjoying an afternoon of unimpeded bliss. This brings me to my second observation. An obvious exclusion in the queer Hellenic narrative of the 19th century was the experience of women, especially queer women. Here, as in other examples below, women are starting to appear, however clumsily, on the queer male radar, as is a more expansive understanding of queer identity. More facetiously, and in direct engagement with bodily experience, both Forster and Firbank seek to unseat 19th century establishment classicism by grasping it right at its prudish core, the fig leaf and everything it represents. Both writers depict scenes in which classical statues are deprived of their fig leaves to the dainty consternation of those around them. In Falmouth, as you can see here, all the fig leaves in a hotel garden are whipped off by an unusually strong gust of wind, and not for the first time. We can maybe read this as the natural world reclaiming an authentic engagement with the naked body. And the inhabitants refuse to even look outside until propriety is reinstated. In Forster's short story, The Classical Annex, a beleaguered museum curator finds himself battling to replace a statue's fig leaf which keeps falling off, eventually becoming impossible to replace as the artifacts in the annex develop their own agency and the offending statue becomes grotesquely priapic. In an inversion of the Galatea myth, the statue comes to life only to seduce and have sex with the curator's son Dennis, ironically a classical name. The two figures then return to stone and are immortalised in the act of penetration, although Forster very wryly then has some classical historians come and visit the scene and interpret it as a wrestling scene between two brothers, a joke which unfortunately still resonates all too strongly today. Denis, or Dionysus, is perhaps a fitting link to what I understand to be the most significant trope in evidence here, as it unsettles not only the 19th century public schoolmaster, but the wholesale valorization of classical literacy, even within queer modes of engagement. I'm talking about the great god Pan, whose symbolic association suddenly becomes rife in Edwardian literature as a whole. You've only got to think of J.M. Barrie's eponymous work, or the Piper at the Gates of Dawn in Kenneth Grahame's The Wind in the Willows. Jonathan Rose goes into detail on possible reasons behind the Edwardian cult of Pan. He suggests, quote, a combination of spiritual and sexual anxieties which led them to create a surrogate religion of sexuality. The principal deity of this religion was Pan, the pre-moral nature god, to incarnate the Edwardian id, end quote. Somerset Maugham, writing in 1930, reflects back on this sudden literary vogue, noting that, quote, in 100 novels his cloven hoof left its imprint on the sward. Poets saw him lurking in the twilight, end quote. Yet Maugham, as much as anybody, contributed to this list of Caprine cameos, although his own presentation of Pan was representative of other more socially conservative Catholic writers of the period, with the horned god representing almost a sort of satanic, frightening figure. Dubbed the equivocal god by Saki, whose own short story, The Music on the Hill, can also be counted in this list, Pan as the disinterested face of classicism offers different things to different people in this period. To writers at the more liberal end, such as Forster and Firbank, Pan is still an alarming figure, but often a force for good. He breaks up stale marriages, precipitates sexual awakenings, and calls into question deep-seated mores regarding gender, capitalism, and industrialization. Much like the wind bringing the fig leaves smashing down, the figure of Pan is a force of nature, regularly intruding on the picnics, holidays, and social calls, representative of superficial Edwardian respectability. And it's here that we might uncover a deeper, more subversive address to that quality which saturates Forster and Firbank's literary forebears, that illusory quality we call classics. Don Adams notes how Pan, that uninhibited pastoral deity, even finds himself invoked in the sterile vacuity of a suburban Edwardian drawing room. In Vainglory, here Lady Anne Pantry's ear-splitting shrieks cause those around her to assume the death of the great god. In Forster's appropriately titled The Story of a Panic, 1912, Pan is expressed through Gennaro, the queer-coded Italian boy, doubly other, who takes repressed public schoolboy Eustace into the woods and saves him from living inauthentically. Elsewhere, in The Curate's Friend, Pan appears in person, romantically presented as a relic from the Roman occupation of Britain who flourished because there is nothing particularly classical about a faun. Here too, Pan is a conduit for sexual awakening, although here a heterosexual one. Emily, the curate's intended, finds herself driven into another man's arms following the faun's divine intervention. So whilst the late 19th century's queer, classicised aestheticism may be understood as grounded in the city and the university, what we're seeing here is a more universalised quality, evident anywhere in the natural world should one wish to look. It's not only the classics of the heteronormative which is beginning to discolour as we move further into the 20th century. In another of Forster's short stories, The Other Kingdom, also 1911, the narrator is actually a classics tutor who's employed in a household which completely implodes after the eldest son of the house, a thrusting young businessman and product of the post-industrial age, attempts to privatise and domesticate a patch of woodland in a misguided gift for his reluctant fiancée, Evelyn. In another exploration of sexuality and gender, Evelyn's distress finds her invoking the wrath of the god. Pan rips up the carefully manicured paths and arbours which have been imposed on his land, and Evelyn herself becomes one with the wood by turning into a beech tree, Daphne-like. Interestingly, much like the humble schoolboy who successfully rode the celestial omnibus, Forster is at pains to emphasise that Evelyn is actually very bad at Latin. In fact, being bad at Latin or Greek seems almost a prerequisite for authentic classical engagement in Forster. When the eponymous Morris is caught daydreaming in class, he tries to redeem himself by responding, "Oh, sir, dative absolute?" A Latin construction which doesn't exist. The queer hero of a celebrated queer love story has, by his own admission, little interest in the ancient people he is supposed to consider his sexual as well as intellectual forebears. The daydream that Morris is enjoying prior to his rude awakening by the schoolmaster involves the face of a handsome young man. He ponders, was he a Greek god, such as illustrates the classical dictionary? More probable, but most probably, he was just a man. So sat in his Victorian British public school, the air redolent with classicised potential, Morris considers making the link between the queer and the classical and immediately dismisses it. He may be surrounded by the stuff, but it just doesn't work for him. Crucially, the narratorial voice later notes that Morris's, quote, interest in the classics had been slight and obscene and had vanished when he loved Clive, end quote. Clive, who asks him on their first meeting at Cambridge if he'd ever read the Symposium, goes on to provide Morris with the real thing, and this achieved, Morris considers his relationship with Plato now redundant. The reference to a classical dictionary is particularly interesting, as we know from biographers that the young Forster enjoyed perusing different classical dictionaries, not for communion with the queer Platonic ideal, but for the chance sighting of undraped male dirties, Forster's euphemism for the penis. Similarly, one might expect these woodcuts of classical nudes to be discarded once the real thing came along. Clive, whose Platonism in many ways echoes that of the Cambridge Apostles, is the one who makes the required pilgrimage to Greece, while Morris stubbornly remains at home. Clive returns from Greece both physically unwell and with his future wife in tow, whereas Morris, unashamedly Greekless Morris, is the one who flourishes, finding his true love Alec in an otherwise unremarkable English garden, one of which the great god Pan might approve. As Forster and Firbank would have it then, this queer classicised yet declassicising potential is something that exists beyond Amoa Masamat and is in the very fabric of the world around us. I've ended the handout by quoting Evelyn, the young woman from the other kingdom, who manages to elude the marital expectations placed on her by becoming one with nature and the great god Pan. Prior to her ultimate union with her beloved woodland, she teases her husband-to-be by quoting Virgil's Eclogues 2, line 60, sung in English with a playful and incongruous superimposition of metre. Ah, you silly ass, gods live in woods. In spite of her Cambridge-educated tutor's ministrations, Evelyn is not taking her classics seriously. She doesn't need to. Gods of classicism's past continue to live on in our woods, and we no longer require a public schoolmaster to help us see them. Thank you.